The shell weighs 33 pounds. Inside its nose cone, behind a thin steel cap designed to shatter on impact, sits something that has no business existing in 1944. A radio transmitter the size of a whiskey glass, 4 vacuum tubes smaller than a man's thumb, a battery that activates only when fired. The shell is spinning at 15,000 revolutions per minute as it arcs over the Ardennes forest, broadcasting, listening, counting down to detonation. 1,200 feet below, in a foxhole scraped into frozen Belgian soil, a German grenadier is doing exactly what has kept him alive through 3 years of war. He is staying low. The hole is 18 inches deep, enough to defeat shrapnel from a shell bursting on the ground 20 meters away. He learned this in Russia. He knows the mathematics of survival. A 105 round throws its fragments in a cone pattern, radiating outward from the point of detonation. Below the cone, you live. He is below the cone. The shell's tiny radar set bounces a signal off the treetops, measures the return time, calculates altitude. 70 feet, 50, 30. At precisely 23 feet above the frozen earth, 4 meters higher than the tip of a bayonet held overhead, the fuse completes a circuit. The shell becomes a cloud of steel moving at 3,200 feet per second. The fragments spray downward. The grenadier's foxhole is inside the cone. Casualty reports from the first week of proximity. Fuse deployment against ground targets showed something American artillery officers refused to believe until the numbers came back a second time. A 300% increase in casualties per round expended, not 300% more shells. 300% more dead Germans from the same number of shells. Every piece of infantry mathematics the German army had learned since 1939, the spacing, the depth of cover, the calculations about where to be when steel starts flying, had been rendered obsolete by a glass tube the size of a lipstick case. The shells burst in the air. One captured Wehrmacht NCO told his interrogators. We could not understand how. The confusion was total, and it's why the proximity fuse remains one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Second World War. Not because the technology was complex, because the German army couldn't adapt to it. And you can't adapt to something you can't explain. If you had family who served in Europe, infantry, artillery, anyone who was there when the shells started bursting differently, drop the unit in the comments. Like and subscribe to help these stories reach more people. The fuse had a designation that told you nothing, VT for variable time. The name was a deliberate lie. There was nothing variable about it. The timing was precise to within 3 feet of altitude. The Army called it variable because they needed to call it something, and the real name, proximity fuse, would have told German intelligence exactly what to look for. By December of 1944, the fuse had been deployed against aircraft for 18 months. The Navy had used it to shred Japanese kamikaze attacks, but ground commanders had been forbidden to fire it over land the enemy might capture. The technology was too valuable to risk. German scientists finding an intact fuse in a dud shell could reverse engineer the whole program. Then, the Wehrmacht launched its offensive through the Ardennes, and the restrictions evaporated. The German grenadier in his foxhole never heard the shell that killed him. The fragments arrived before the sound. His body would be found in a position that made no sense to the recovery team, curled in cover that should have protected him, killed by steel that came from a direction Artillery was not supposed to reach. The mathematics of survival had changed. Nobody had told the Germans. Merle Tuve held a vacuum tube between his thumb and forefinger, turning it slowly in the light of his Carnegie Institution laboratory. The tube was the size of a cigarette, wrapped in a steel jacket, packed with components so small his technicians had needed watchmakers' tools to assemble them. It smelled faintly of solder flux and machining oil. Tuve had spent 18 months of his life on this object, and in approximately 1/50th of a second, he was going to subject it to forces that every electrical engineer in America had told him would turn it into glass dust. 20,000 Gs. That was the acceleration inside a gun barrel, 20,000 times the force of gravity, applied instantaneously when the propellant charge detonated. A human body would liquefy. A standard vacuum tube would shatter before the shell cleared the muzzle. The filaments would snap. The electrodes would fuse. The glass envelope would become powder. Every textbook, every manufacturer, every expert Tuve consulted in 1940 and 1941 said the same thing. You cannot fire electronics from a cannon. The physics forbids it. Tuve's response to this consensus was to fire electronics from a cannon anyway, again and again and again, until the physics stopped forbidding it. Section T of the Office of Scientific Research and Development operated out of a former automobile garage in Silver Spring, Maryland. The space had no windows. The concrete floor was perpetually cold, even in summer, and the overhead lights cast a yellow pall that made everyone look tubercular. By 1942, Tuve had 200 physicists working 3 shifts. Their job was to make a radio transmitter, complete with oscillator, amplifier, detector, and power supply, small enough to fit in a fuse body, and tough enough to survive being shot out of a 5-inch naval gun. The problem was the tubes. Standard vacuum tubes had thin glass walls, delicate filaments suspended on hair-thin wires, electrodes mounted with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Apply 20,000 Gs, and every one of those tolerances became a failure mode. Tuve's team tried reinforcing the glass. The tubes still shattered. They tried different filament materials. The filaments still snapped. They tried potting the entire assembly in wax, rubber, and experimental plastics. The tubes still died. The solution came from rethinking what a vacuum tube was supposed to be. Standard tubes were designed to last 10,000 hours. Tuve didn't need 10,000 hours. He needed 10 seconds, the flight time of a shell from gun to target. Everything else was irrelevant. His team stopped trying to make durable tubes and started making disposable ones. Shorter filaments that couldn't resonate, thicker glass that absorbed shock, electrodes so rigidly mounted they couldn't vibrate, components packed so tight they had no room to shift. Each tube worked for exactly long enough to do its job, then ceased to matter. By mid-1942, Section T was achieving 80% reliability. 8 out of 10 shells fired from a test gun at Dahlgren, Virginia, contained functioning electronics when they reached their target altitude. The Navy, which had been skeptical, stopped being skeptical. The numbers were the argument. Tuve wasn't promising a weapon. He was demonstrating one. The manufacturing problem was harder than the physics. Each fuse required 130 components, tubes, resistors, capacitors, a wet cell battery that activated on firing, a tiny antenna that doubled as the shell's nose cone. Every component had to work. Every component had to survive launch. American industry had never mass-produced anything this precise in quantities this large. Tuve's team wrote specifications so demanding that factories initially refused the contracts. The tolerances were aerospace grade, the volumes ammunition grade. No one had ever done both at once. 12 million fuses shipped by 1945. 12 million tiny radars, each one carrying the solution to a problem every expert said couldn't be solved. The shells that burst over the Ardennes carried technology that had been theoretical 3 years earlier. Technology that existed because one physicist refused to accept that the physics forbade it. The weapon that could have shortened the war by months sat in ammunition bunkers, forbidden. That was the calculation American commanders faced from 1943 onward. Every day they didn't use the proximity fuse against ground targets. More infantrymen died to conventional artillery duels. Every day they did use it. They risked a dud shell landing intact in enemy territory, its secrets recoverable by any competent German engineer with a screwdriver. The fuse worked. The fuse worked brilliantly. And the fuse stayed locked in storage while men died in Normandy, in the hedgerows, where a single battery of VT-fused 105 rounds could have cleared positions that instead required frontal assaults. The restriction came from the top. Churchill himself had been briefed on the technology. So had Roosevelt. Both understood what a German copy would mean. Every advantage reversed, every American bomber suddenly vulnerable to flak that burst at precisely the right altitude, every convoy at sea exposed, every beach landing contested by artillery that couldn't miss. The Navy had used proximity fuses since January 1943. They had a logic the Army didn't. Shells fired at aircraft exploded over water. Duds sank. The Pacific swallowed the evidence. A Japanese recovery team would need to find a shell casing in thousands of square miles of ocean, then bring it to shore, then get it to engineers who could understand what they were looking at. The odds approached zero, so the Navy fired VT fuses by the thousand against kamikaze attacks, watching aircraft disintegrate at ranges that had previously meant clean misses, and the secret stayed secret. Land was different. Land kept things. A shell that failed to detonate, and 20% still failed, even with Tuve's improvements, would lie in a Belgian field or a French forest until some German patrol found it. One intact fuse. That was all it would take. German industry could tool up within months. German scientists had been working on similar concepts since 1939. They lacked only the miniaturization techniques that Section T had spent 3 years perfecting. Hand them a working model, and the learning curve collapsed. Intelligence officers at Schiaff ran the scenarios. If Germany fielded proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells by mid-1944, bomber losses over the Reich would double. The 8th Air Force was already losing crews at rates that threatened to break the strategic bombing campaign. Add another 50% attrition, and the math stopped working. The 1,000-bomber raids that were grinding down German industry would become impossible. The air superiority that made D-Day conceivable would evaporate, so the fuses stayed in their crates. Artillery officers who had seen the test data, the 300% increase in lethality, the ability to airburst over entrenched positions, to kill troops in defilade, the end of the foxhole as a survival strategy, wrote memoranda requesting deployment authority. The memoranda came back denied. The reasoning was never explained in writing. Most of the officers asking didn't have clearance to know why. The German Ardennes offensive changed the arithmetic. On December 16, 1944, 25 German divisions attacked through the weakest sector of the Allied line. The initial breakthrough was catastrophic. American units were overrun, surrounded, cut off, annihilated in detail. Within 72 hours, the Wehrmacht had punched a bulge 50 miles deep into Allied territory. The strategic reserve was gone. Bastogne was encircled. For the first time since Normandy, an Allied defeat, a real defeat, with operational consequences seemed possible. Eisenhower authorized proximity fuses for ground use on December 18th. The decision took less than a day. Whatever risk the Germans posed by capturing the technology was now smaller than the risk the Germans posed by winning the battle. Crates that had sat sealed in forward ammunition dumps for months were suddenly priority cargo. Within 48 hours, American artillery batteries across the Ardennes were firing shells that thought for themselves. The Germans had forced exactly the scenario American planners had feared, and they were about to discover why American planners had feared it. The fog smelled like pine sap and diesel exhaust. It hung in the Ardennes valleys on the morning of December 16th, so thick that American sentries along the Our River couldn't see 50 yards. Sound carried strangely. Engine noise from somewhere east, maybe trucks, maybe armor, impossible to locate. The men of the 28th Infantry Division had been told this sector was quiet. A rest area. The Ardennes had been quiet since September. At 5:30 a.m., 1,400 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 85-mile front. The shells came without warning. American positions that had been mapped for weeks, command posts, communication centers, supply dumps, road junctions, disappeared in the first minutes. Telephone lines went dead. Radio frequencies jammed with German interference. Forward observers who tried to call for counter-battery fire couldn't reach anyone. Units that had been in contact with their neighbors at 5:29 were alone at 5:31. Behind the barrage came 200,000 German soldiers, 25 divisions, including 9 armored, advancing through gaps in the American line that shouldn't have existed. The 8th Corps, spread across a front designed for twice its strength, came apart in pieces. Battalions were overrun before they could organize resistance. Regiments lost contact with their flanks. The fog that hid the German assembly areas now hid the German advance. American commanders spent the first 6 hours trying to understand what was happening. The reports that filtered back made no sense. Germans in American uniforms, paratroopers behind the lines, armor columns moving on roads the map said couldn't support armor. Each report contradicted the last. By noon, the only certainty was that the front had collapsed, and no one knew how badly. The Germans knew. They were executing Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, a plan so audacious that Allied intelligence had dismissed the indicators as deception. Hitler himself had conceived it. Punch through the Ardennes, split the British and American armies, seize Antwerp, force a negotiated peace in the West. The offensive committed Germany's last strategic reserve. Every tank, every gallon of fuel, every trained soldier who could be scraped from the Eastern Front went into the Ardennes. Victory or annihilation. No middle outcome. By December 17th, the scope became clear. not a spoiling attack or local counter-offensive. The largest German operation since Barbarossa, aimed at the weakest point in the Allied line, launched with complete surprise. American units were surrounded at Saint-Vith, at Bastogne, at a dozen crossroads whose names meant nothing until that week. The German spearheads had penetrated 20 miles in 2 days, 40 miles by the 19th. Eisenhower received the first accurate reports at his headquarters in Versailles on the evening of the 16th. By the morning of the 17th, he understood the stakes. If the Germans reached the Meuse River crossings, the entire Allied position in northwest Europe became untenable. If they took Antwerp, the war might last another year, maybe 2. The reserves didn't exist. The 82nd and 101st Airborne were refitting after Market Garden, exhausted, under strength, scattered across France. Patton's Third Army was committed in the Saar, facing the wrong direction. Every division that could move was already moving, but movement took time, and time was what the Germans were buying with blood. Artillery was faster. Artillery was already in position, and in ammunition dumps across the rear areas sat crates of shells that had been forbidden since Normandy, shells that could kill Germans in their foxholes, in their half-tracks, in positions that conventional rounds couldn't reach. The secrecy calculus that had governed 18 months of decisions collapsed in 48 hours. If the Germans won the Ardennes, there would be nothing left to protect. No bomber offensive, no amphibious operations, just a negotiated stalemate that would leave Hitler in power. Eisenhower signed the authorization. The crates opened. The geometry of death changed on December 22, 1944. That was when the first proximity-fused rounds reached forward artillery positions in meaningful quantities, not test batches, not demonstration stocks, but ammunition by the truckload, enough to sustain fire missions for days. Battery commanders who had spent months wondering what the sealed crates contained now understood why no one had told them. A conventional artillery shell kills when it hits something. The fuse strikes earth, stone, a tree trunk, the roof of a building. The explosive charge detonates. Fragments radiate outward in a roughly spherical pattern, constrained by the ground beneath. Half the lethal energy, more than half, depending on soil conditions, goes directly into the dirt. A soldier in a foxhole 18 inches deep is largely protected. The fragments that would kill him are absorbed by the earth between his position and the impact point. Dig deeper, and the protection increases. German defensive doctrine understood this arithmetic. Infantry dug in the moment they stopped moving. A man below ground level was survivable. A man above it was not. The proximity fuse inverted the equation. A shell that detonates 70 feet in the air, the optimal height for anti-personnel effect against troops in the open, sprays fragments downward in a cone. The ground doesn't absorb the blast. The ground receives it. A foxhole becomes a collection point for shrapnel instead of a shield against it. The fragments arrive at steep angles, bypassing the lip of the hole, bypassing the packed earth that conventional artillery couldn't penetrate. One shell covers the area that previously required 3. The multiplication isn't linear, it's geometric. The original lethality studies are scattered across 3 archives now: the National Archives at College Park, the Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, and a partially catalogued collection at Aberdeen Proving Ground that researchers have to request by box number because no complete index exists. The 1943 test data from Dahlgren went through 4 classification reviews before partial release in 1971. Some pages are still redacted. Fragment velocity tables, optimal burst height calculations, comparative casualty estimates against entrenched versus exposed targets. The Army decided in 1947 that certain details served no peacetime purpose. The smell of a proximity-fused airburst was different from a ground impact. Soldiers who experienced both described it afterward. Less earth in the air, more cordite, a sharper chemical bite that caught in the throat. The sound was different too. A crack rather than a thump, the detonation unmuffled by soil. German prisoners taken in late December reported that the new American shells seemed to explode before they landed. They weren't wrong. One Wehrmacht NCO, interrogated at a collection point near Bastogne, told his captors that his unit had lost 11 men to a single salvo, 11 men in holes that should have protected them. The interrogation report uses the German word unbegreiflich, incomprehensible. American artillery officers adapted their fire missions within days. The standard ground burst techniques they had learned at Fort Sill became secondary. Time on target barrages, multiple batteries timing their fire so all shells arrived simultaneously, gained a new dimension when every shell burst at optimal height regardless of terrain. A concentration that would have suppressed a German company now annihilated it. The math that had governed artillery duels since 1914 stopped applying. The Germans had no equivalent. Their own proximity fuse program, running since 1939 under the designation Kranich, had never solved the miniaturization problem. Their shells still required contact or timed fuses, still buried half their fragments in Belgian mud, still left men alive in holes that should have been graves. The American advantage wasn't incremental, it was categorical. One side had weapons that thought. The other side had weapons that guessed. The brass casing was cold enough to stick to bare skin. Battery B of the 333rd Field Artillery loaded their first proximity-fused rounds at 0700 on December 23rd, working with gloves that made the work clumsy, breath-freezing in clouds that obscured their hands. The shells looked identical to what they'd been firing for months. Same olive drab paint, same stenciled lot numbers, same weight when they hefted them into the breech. The difference was invisible. A small radio behind the nose cone, 4 vacuum tubes, a battery that wouldn't activate until the shell left the barrel at 900 feet per second. The fire mission called for a concentration on a tree line 1,200 yards northeast of Bastogne, where German infantry had been observed massing for another assault on the perimeter. 6 guns, 4 rounds each. The battery commander had received his briefing on the new ammunition 40 minutes earlier. A hasty explanation from an ordnance officer who seemed nervous about something he couldn't quite articulate. Optimal burst height 70 feet. Do not fire into dense forest canopy. Do not attempt to adjust fuse settings. The shells would handle the rest. The first salvo left the tubes at 0714. 24 shells arced through the frozen air toward the German positions. What happened next exists in fragments, after-action reports that contradict each other, German survivor accounts collected months later. American Forward Observer notes that someone typed up in February 1945 and filed in a folder that spent 31 years in a warehouse in St. Louis before a records consolidation moved it to College Park. The folder's label reads 333rd FA Battalion, December 44, MISC, in faded typewriter ink. Inside, a single page describes the effect on the German assembly area in language that reads like someone trying to be clinical and failing. Enemy casualties observed falling in open ground and in prepared positions. No adjustment required. Fire repeated. The Germans in that tree line had done everything right. They had dug in, spaced their positions to minimize the effect of individual shell impacts. 5 years of war had taught them exactly how deep a hole needed to be to survive artillery. The holes weren't deep enough. The shells burst above them, not on impact with the frozen earth, not after burying themselves in snowdrifts, but in the air, 70 feet up, spraying fragments downward at angles that found men who thought they were protected. The geometry their training assumed no longer applied. A German Feldwebel from the 9th Panzer Division, captured on December 26th, described it to his interrogators. His squad had taken cover in a drainage ditch when they heard the American guns fire. Standard procedure: wait for the impacts, wait for the fragments to pass overhead, then move. But the fragments didn't pass overhead. They came down. 3 men died in the first seconds, 2 more in the next salvo. The Feldwebel himself took a steel splinter through his shoulder that shattered his scapula. He told the interrogator he had survived Russian artillery at Kursk, British guns at Caen, American artillery in the hedgerows. He had never seen shells that killed men in holes. The batteries around Bastogne fired 1,700 proximity-fused rounds on December 23rd alone. By Christmas Eve, forward observers were reporting that German infantry refused to advance across open ground, even when their armor had broken through. The men who had crossed that ground earlier weren't moving anymore. Assembly areas that should have launched coordinated attacks produced only scattered rushes, small groups of soldiers sprinting between cover, while the rest stayed frozen in positions that had become coffins. The German offensive required mass, concentrated formations hitting weak points simultaneously. The proximity fuse made concentration lethal. Every man standing near another man became a target for fragments meant for both. 387%. That was the figure a German staff officer calculated in a report dated January 9th, 1945, comparing infantry casualties per 100 rounds of American artillery fire between the first week of December and the last. The methodology was crude. Field estimates, medical evacuation logs, unit strength reports that contradicted each other, but the order of magnitude was unmistakable. Something had changed. The American guns fired the same calibers, the same rates, from the same positions. The shells killed nearly 4 times as many men. The report circulated through Army Group B headquarters, at a moment when headquarters had more urgent concerns than statistical anomalies. The Ardennes offensive was failing. Bastogne hadn't fallen. The Meuse crossings remained in Allied hands. Fuel shortages had frozen entire panzer columns on roads they couldn't leave. But the casualty figures demanded attention, because they implied something worse than tactical failure. They implied the Americans had developed a weapon the Wehrmacht couldn't counter, a weapon no one had warned them about. Survivors described it in fragments that didn't cohere. The shells exploded too soon, too high, everywhere at once. A lieutenant from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, interviewed at a field hospital near Prüm, said his company had lost 31 men in a barrage that should have killed 8. The mathematics were wrong, he kept repeating, as if repetition might correct them. He had watched soldiers die in positions that would have protected them from any artillery he had ever seen. Positions that had protected them at Anzio, at Monte Cassino, at 100 battles before the Ardennes. The interrogation transcripts from P.O. Box 1142, the Fort Hunt facility, where high-value German prisoners were held and secretly recorded, preserve conversations that never appeared in official reports. 2 captured officers from the Panzer Lehr Division, speaking to each other in what they believed was privacy, tried to explain the American artillery to themselves. One suggested a new type of explosive, something chemical. The other insisted the shells must be radar-guided. Kleine Radargeräte, he called them, little radar sets, which was closer to the truth than he could have known. Neither man could accept that the shells simply detonated at the right height every time, automatically, without adjustment, without observation. The technology required to achieve that effect didn't exist, except it did. The smell of the dead changed over Christmas. The cold preserved bodies, but couldn't stop the process entirely. German recovery teams working at night, trying to retrieve wounded from positions overrun earlier that day, reported finding men killed in ways they couldn't explain. Soldiers with fragment wounds in their backs while facing the American lines. Soldiers killed inside covered positions by steel that had found its way through gaps no conventional burst could have exploited. One recovery party lost 4 of its own men to a single airburst while collecting the dead from an airburst that had killed 6 others. The pattern was self-reinforcing. By December 28th, German infantry tactics in the Ardennes had abandoned 5 years of doctrine. Units stopped digging in. The positions that should have protected them drew the airbursts instead. They stopped massing for attacks, stopped advancing or retreating across open ground, stopped doing anything that exposed more than 2 or 3 men at a time to American observation. The offensive that had required speed, concentration, shock, all the principles that had won France in 1940, couldn't execute any of them. A German corps commander wrote in his post-war FMS interview that his men had faced an artillery unlike any in our experience. He called the effect vernichtend, annihilating. His word, not the interviewer's. He said his infantry had simply refused to leave cover after the 3rd day of the new shells. Not because they were cowards, because they had watched what happened to the men who weren't. Grenadier Werner Holst pressed his face into frozen mud as the American guns opened up, his body performing the motion it had learned at a training depot outside Bremen in 1942. Knees drawn up, helmet tilted forward to protect the neck, hands flat against the earth, spine curved to present the smallest possible profile to horizontal fragmentation. The drill instructor had made them practice it until muscle memory took over. You heard the whistle of incoming shells. You dropped. You survived. 3 years on the Eastern Front had proven the technique. Kursk, Zhytomyr. Holst had survived barrages that killed the men standing beside him. Survived because he knew how to become part of the ground. The shell that killed him on December 27th landed 63 feet above his position and sprayed 700 fragments into an area the size of a tennis court. Holst died face down in the posture that had saved his life 11 times before. The records don't specify Holst's unit. His name appears in a field burial report recovered from the 9th SS Panzer Division's administrative files, one line among 47 men interred that day near the village of Bura. The cause of death is listed as artillery fire, the same notation that covered every variety of high-explosive death the Wehrmacht had catalogued since 1939. But the burial party noted something else in the margin of their log: überwiegend Rücken- und Schulterwunden, predominantly back and shoulder wounds. The fragments had come from above. The men who died face down were hit in the parts of their bodies they had deliberately exposed to what should have been empty sky. The smell of blood mixed with cordite hung in the air that morning. Not the iron and earth smell of a conventional barrage where bodies lay in craters, but something sharper, more chemical, the scent of explosive residue that hadn't been absorbed by impact with frozen ground. Survivors of the burial detail remembered the cold, making the blood tacky rather than liquid. Their hands went numb inside their gloves as they rolled bodies onto stretchers. None of them could explain the strange pattern of wounds until after the war ended. The geometry of protection required overhead cover. That was the only countermeasure that worked. Logs, sandbags, the steel roof of a bunker, anything that could intercept fragments traveling at 3,500 feet per second on a downward trajectory. German positions on the Siegfried Line had such cover. The hastily constructed foxholes and slit trenches of an offensive operation did not. Building overhead cover required tools, materials, labor, time, hours of work with entrenching equipment to cut logs, drag them into position, layer earth on top until the structure could absorb a near miss. The American artillery fired every 10 minutes. The mathematics were impossible. A squad that tried to improve its position exposed itself to the same shells it was trying to shelter from. The infantry manual's diagrams of proper field fortifications, the ones every German soldier had memorized in basic training, showed positions designed to defeat horizontal fragmentation from ground-burst artillery. The diagrams were obsolete. Nobody updated them until 1946, and by then, the men who had died following them were already in graves scattered across the Ardennes. One German engineer officer, captured near Houffalize in January, told his interrogators that his battalion had requested timber for overhead cover on December 24th. The request reached Corps headquarters on the 27th. The authorization came through on January 3rd. By then, the battalion had ceased to exist as a combat formation. 81 men dead, another 112 wounded, from a unit that had begun the offensive with 420. The engineer officer kept the authorization slip in his breast pocket when he surrendered. He showed it to his captors. Someone filed it with his interrogation transcript, where it sat for 30 years before a researcher found it. We knew what was killing us. We simply could not stop it. General Major Friedrich von Broich spoke those words to an American intelligence officer in March 1945, 3 months after the Ardennes offensive collapsed. The transcript notes that von Broich paused before continuing, that he asked for water, that his hands shook when he lifted the glass. He had commanded elements of the 10th SS Panzer Division through the final week of December. He had watched his infantry strength drop from 2,200 effectives to fewer than 600 in 11 days. The interrogator asked him what countermeasures German forces had attempted. Von Broich's response fills half a page of single-space typing. They had tried everything. Dispersal, spreading men so far apart that a single burst couldn't catch more than one or two. But dispersed infantry couldn't mass for attacks or concentrate firepower. They couldn't do anything except hide. They had tried moving only at night, but American artillery fired at suspected positions, regardless of visibility, and the shells didn't need to see their targets. They had tried deeper holes. Von Broich's voice, according to the interrogator's marginal note, became very quiet when he explained why deeper holes made things worse. A man standing in a chest-deep trench exposed only his head and shoulders to horizontal fragmentation. The same man exposed his entire back, his entire skull, his spine from neck to pelvis, to fragments falling from above. The deeper the hole, the more vertical surface area. The mathematics inverted everything they knew. The smell of turned earth hung over every position his men occupied. That wet, mineral smell of Belgian soil, mixed with the sharper tang of explosive residue that never quite dissipated in the cold air. Von Broich remembered visiting a forward battalion on December 29th. The men were filthy, exhausted, hollow-eyed in ways he had seen before on the Eastern Front, but never this quickly. Some of them flinched at sounds that weren't artillery, a truck backfiring, a tree branch cracking under snow weight. Their hands trembled when they saluted. One sergeant, a veteran of Stalingrad, told von Broich that he had requested transfer to an armored unit. Inside a panzer, at least the steel was overhead. The timber problem appears in 6 separate FMS reports from Ardennes commanders. Overhead cover required logs, 8 inches in diameter minimum, layered 3 deep, covered with earth. A single squad position needed 30 to 40 man-hours of labor to construct properly. Multiply that by the hundreds of positions a division required. Multiply that by the dozens of divisions in the salient. The forests of the Ardennes contained plenty of trees, but cutting them required axes and saws that were with the engineer battalions, and the engineer battalions were building bridges and clearing roads and doing everything except cutting timber for infantry positions. The request forms piled up at Corps headquarters. The timber didn't arrive. One German staff officer calculated after the war that protecting his division's infantry from American airbursts would have required 14,000 logs and 72 hours of uninterrupted construction time. The American artillery fired an average of 1 mission every 8 minutes during daylight hours. The construction time didn't exist. The logs didn't exist. The men who would have cut and carried and stacked them were dead or wounded or pinned in positions they couldn't leave. Von Broich told the interrogator that by New Year's Day, his remaining infantry had developed what he called Granatenschock, shell shock specific to the new American ammunition. Men who had fought through 5 years of war, men who had survived Stalingrad and Kursk and Normandy, sat in their holes and wept when the guns opened up. Not because they were weak, because they understood, with perfect clarity, that nothing they did would save them. The skills that had kept them alive were now the reflexes that killed them. The holes they dug were traps, the cover they sought imaginary. They had been taught to fight one war. The Americans had started another. January 3rd, 1945, 0800 hours. The German offensive in the Ardennes officially ended, quietly, with Army Group B reporting to OKW that further westward movement was impossible. The salient that had bulged 40 miles into Allied lines began collapsing inward, pressed from three sides by American forces that had never stopped firing those strange shells that burst in midair. The ammunition reports tell the story in numbers. First Army artillery units expended 473,000 proximity-fused rounds between December 22nd and January 16th. 473,000 tiny radar sets, each one carrying technology that German engineers wouldn't fully understand until they examined captured samples in February. By then, the samples were irrelevant. The factories that might have copied them were rubble. The infantry that might have been protected by countermeasures was dead. General Lieutenant Edmund Gruber wrote his Foreign Military Studies report in 1947, 2 years after the war ended, working from memory and the scattered documents he had managed to preserve. His assessment of American artillery in the Ardennes fills 11 pages. The proximity fuse occupies 3 of them. He called it the most decisive technical advantage enjoyed by American ground forces during the campaign. He acknowledged that American tanks, aircraft, and logistics were extraordinary. But the fuse, the small glass tubes that fired radio waves at the ground and detonated 33-pound shells at exactly the height where fragments spread widest, that was what broke his infantry. George Patton made his own assessment in a letter to the Chief of Ordnance dated January 21, 1945. The proximity fuse, he wrote, was one of 3 American developments that would be remembered as war-winning technologies, alongside radar and the atomic bomb. Patton was prone to hyperbole. He was not wrong. The men who had insisted that vacuum tubes could survive 20,000 Gs of acceleration, who had been told by every expert that the physics forbade it, had manufactured a weapon that killed more German soldiers per shell than any artillery in history. The production figures climbed through 1945, 22 million proximity fuse by VE Day. The factories that had seemed impossibly ambitious in 1942, Crossley, RCA, Eastman Kodak, Sylvania, were running 3 shifts, 7 days a week, turning out fuses faster than the artillery could fire them. The shells that had been too secret to use over land in 1943 were standard issue by the time the Rhine crossings began. Every battery had them. Every forward observer knew how to call for them. The Germans knew they were coming, and the Germans could do nothing except die. A sergeant from the 463rd Field Artillery Battalion wrote home in March 1945, after his unit had crossed into Germany proper. The letter survives in his family's collection, donated to the Army Heritage Center in 2008. He described watching a German infantry company attempt to cross open ground near the town of Remagen. "We put 6 rounds of posit on them," he wrote. 6 rounds. When the smoke cleared, there wasn't anybody standing, not wounded, not running, just bodies. 50, 60 men, 6 rounds. He asked his mother not to share the letter with his younger brother. "I don't want him thinking this is what war is supposed to look like." The shells kept falling through April, through the Ruhr pocket, through the drive to the Elbe. American artillery fired proximity fuses at German positions that had no overhead cover because there was no time to build it, no timber to build it with, no men left who remembered how to survive what couldn't be survived. The last German soldiers to face the weapon died the same way the first ones had, face down in holes that protected them from nothing, killed by fragments that fell from a sky they had been taught was empty. The Americans, one captured Oberst told his interrogator in April, fought a different war than we did.